History, a retro scenario. In a violent and contemporary period of history, let's say between the two world wars and the Cold War, it is myth that invades cinema as imaginary content. It is the golden age of despotic and legendary resurrections. Myth, chased from the real by the violence of history, finds refuge in cinema. Today, it is history itself that invades the cinema according to the same scenario, the historical stake chased from our lives by this sort of immense neutralization, which is dubbed peaceful coexistence on a global level, and pacified monotony on the quotidian level. This history exorcised by a slowly or brutally congealing society celebrates its resurrection in force on the screen, according to the same process that used to make lost myths live again. History is our lost referential, that is to say our myth. It is by virtue of this fact that it takes the place of myths on the screen. The illusion would be to congratulate oneself on this awareness of history on the part of cinema, as one congratulated oneself on the entrance of politics into the university. Same misunderstanding, same mystification. The politics that enter the university are those that come from history, a retro politics, emptied of substance and legalized in their superficial exercise, with the air of a game and a field of adventure. This kind of politics is like sexuality or permanent education, or like social security in its time, that is, posthumous liberalization. The great event of this period, the great trauma, is this decline of strong referentials, these death pangs of the real and of the rational that open onto an age of simulation. Whereas so many generations, and particularly the last, lived in the march of history, in the euphoric or catastrophic expectation of a revolution, today one has the impression that history has retreated, leaving behind it an indifferent nebula, traversed by currents, but emptied of references. It is into this void that the phantasms of a past history recede, the panoply of events, ideologies, retro fashions, no longer so much because people believe in them or still place some hope in them, but simply to resurrect the period when at least there was history, at least there was violence, albeit fascist, when at least life and death were at stake. Anything serves to escape this void, this leukemia of history and of politics, this hemorrhage of values. It is in proportion to this distress that all content can be evoked pell-mell, that all previous history is resurrected in bulk. A controlling idea no longer selects, only nostalgia endlessly accumulates. War, fascism, the pageantry of the Belle Epoque, or the revolutionary struggles, everything is equivalent and is mixed indiscriminately in the same morose and funereal exaltation, in the same retro fascination. There is however a privileging of the immediately preceding era, fascism, war, the period immediately following the war. The innumerable films that play on these themes for us have a closer, more perverse, denser, more confused essence. One can explain it by evoking the Freudian theory of fetishism, perhaps also a retro hypothesis. This trauma, loss of referentials, is similar to the discovery of the difference between the sexes in children, as serious, as profound, as irreversible. The fetishization of an object intervenes to obscure this unbearable discovery, but precisely, says Freud, this object is not just any object, it is often the last object perceived before the traumatic discovery. Thus the fetishized history will preferably be the one immediately preceding our irreferential era. Whence the omnipresence of fascism and of war in retro, a coincidence, an affinity that is not at all political. It is naive to conclude that the evocation of fascism signals a current renewal of fascism. It is precisely because one is no longer there, because one is in something else, which is still less amusing. It is for this reason that fascism can again become fascinating in its filtered cruelty, aestheticized by retro. History thus made its triumphal entry into cinema. Posthumously, the term historical has undergone the same fate. A historical moment, monument, congress, figure are in this way designated as fossils. Its reinjection has no value as conscious awareness but only as nostalgia for a lost referential. This does not signify that history has never appeared in cinema as a powerful moment, as a contemporary process, as insurrection, and not as resurrection. In the real as in cinema, there was history but there isn't any anymore. Today, the history that is given back to us, precisely because it was taken from us, has no more of a relation to a historical real than neo-figuration in painting does to the classical figuration of the real. Neo-figuration is an invocation of resemblance, but at the same time the flagrant proof of the disappearance of objects in their very representation, hyperreal. Therein objects shine in a sort of hyperresemblance, like history in contemporary cinema, that makes it so that fundamentally they no longer resemble anything, except the empty figure of resemblance, the empty form of representation. It is a question of life or death. These objects are no longer either living or deadly. That is why they are so exact, so minute, frozen in the state in which a brutal loss of the real would have seized them. All, but not only, those historical films whose very perfection is disquieting, Chinatown, 3 Days of the Condor, Barry Lyndon, 1900, All the President's Men, etc. One has the impression of it being a question of perfect remakes, of extraordinary montages that emerge more from a combinatory culture, or McLuhanesque mosaic, of large photo-kino- historico-synthesis machines, etc., rather than one of veritable films. Let's understand each other. Their quality is not in question. The problem is rather that in some sense we are left completely indifferent. Take the Last Picture Show. Like me, you would have had to be sufficiently distracted to have thought it to be an original production from the 1950s, a very good film about the customs in and the atmosphere of the American small town. Just a slight suspicion, it was a little too good, more in tune, better than the others, without the psychological, moral, and sentimental blotches of the films of that era. Stupefaction when one discovers that it is a 1970s film, perfect retro, purged, pure, the hyperrealist restitution of 1950s cinema. One talks of remaking silent films, those will also doubtlessly be better than those of the period. A whole generation of films is emerging that will be to those one knew what the android is to man, marvelous artifacts, without weakness, pleasing simulacra that lack only the imaginary, and the hallucination inherent to cinema. Most of what we see today, the best, is already of this order. Barry Lyndon is the best example. One never did better, one will never do better in what? Not in evoking, not even in evoking, in simulating. All the toxic radiation has been filtered, all the ingredients are there, in precise doses, not a single error. Cool, cold pleasure, not even aesthetic in the strict sense, functional pleasure, equational pleasure, pleasure of machination. One only has to dream of Visconti, Gerpard, Senso, etc., which in certain respects make one think of Barry Lyndon, to grasp the difference. Not only in style, but in the cinematographic act. In Visconti, there is meaning, history, essential rhetoric, dead time, a passionate game, not only in the historical content, but in the mise-en scene. None of that in Kubrick, who manipulates his film like a chess player, who makes an operational scenario of history. And this does not return to the old opposition between the spirit of finesse and the spirit of geometry, that opposition still comes from the game and the stakes of meaning, whereas we are entering an era of films that in themselves no longer have meaning strictly speaking, an era of great synthesizing machines of varying geometry. Is there something of this already in Leone's westerns? Maybe. All the registers slide in that direction. Chinatown, it is the detective movie renamed by laser. It is not really a question of perfection. Technical perfection can be part of meaning, and in that case it is neither retro nor hyperrealist, it is an effect of art. Here, technical perfection is an effect of the model, it is one of the referential tactical values. In the absence of real syntax of meaning, one has nothing but the tactical values of a group in which are admirably combined, for example, the CIA as a mythological machine that does everything, Robert Redford as polyvalent star, social relations as a necessary reference to history, technical virtuosity as a necessary reference to cinema. The cinema and its trajectory, from the most fantastic or mythical to the realistic and the hyperrealistic. The cinema in its current efforts is getting closer and closer, and with greater and greater perfection, to the absolute real, in its banality, its veracity, in its naked obviousness, in its boredom, and at the same time in its presumption, in its pretension to being the real, the immediate, the unsignified, which is the craziest of undertakings. Similarly, functionalism's pretension to designating, design, the greatest degree of correspondence between the object and its function, and its use value, is a truly absurd enterprise. No culture has ever had toward its signs this naive and paranoid, Puritan and terrorist vision. Terrorism is always that of the real. Concurrently with this effort toward an absolute correspondence with the real, cinema also approaches an absolute correspondence with itself, and this is not contradictory. It is the very definition of the hyperreal. Hypotyposis and specularity. Cinema plagiarizes itself, recopies itself, remakes its classics, retroactivates its original myths, remakes the silent film more perfectly than the original, etc. All of this is logical. The cinema is fascinated by itself as a lost object as much as it, and we, are fascinated by the real as a lost referent. The cinema and the imaginary, the novelistic, the mythical, unreality, including the delirious use of its own technique, used to have a lively, dialectical, full, dramatic relation. The relation that is being formed today between the cinema and the real is an inverse, negative relation. It results from the loss of specificity of one and of the other. The cold collage, the cool promiscuity, the asexual nuptials of two cold media that evolve in an asymptotic line toward each other, the cinema attempting to abolish itself in the cinematographic, or televised, hyperreal. History is a strong myth, perhaps, along with the unconscious, the last great myth. It is a myth that at once subtended the possibility of an objective enchainment of events and causes and the possibility of a narrative enchainment of discourse. The age of history, if one can call it that, is also the age of the novel. It is this fabulous character, the mythical energy of an event or of a narrative, that today seems to be increasingly lost. Behind a performative and demonstrative logic, the obsession with historical fidelity, with a perfect rendering, as elsewhere the obsession with real time or with the minute quotidianity of Gene Hillman doing the dishes, this negative and implacable fidelity to the materiality of the past, to a particular scene of the past or of the present, to the restitution of an absolute simulacrum of the past or the present, which was substituted for all other value. We are all complicitous in this, and this is irreversible. Because cinema itself contributed to the disappearance of history, and to the advent of the archive. Photography and cinema contributed in large part to the secularization of history, to fixing it in its visible, objective form at the expense of the myths that once traversed it. Today cinema can place all its talent, all its technology in the service of reanimating what it itself contributed to liquidating. It only resurrects ghosts, and it itself is lost therein. Holocaust. Forgetting extermination is part of extermination, because it is also the extermination of memory, of history, of the social, etc. This forgetting is as essential as the event, in any case unlocatable by us, inaccessible to us in its truth. This forgetting is still too dangerous, it must be effaced by an artificial memory. Today, everywhere, it is artificial memories that efface the memory of man, that efface man in his own memory. This artificial memory will be the restaging of extermination, but late, much too late for it to be able to make real waves and profoundly disturb something, and especially through a medium that is itself cold, radiating forgetfulness, deterrence, and extermination in a still more systematic way, if that is possible, than the camps themselves. One no longer makes the Jews pass through the crematorium or the gas chamber, but through the sound track and image track, through the universal screen and the microprocessor. Forgetting, annihilation, finally achieves its aesthetic dimension in this way. It is achieved in retro, finally elevated here to a mass level. Even the type of socio-historical dimension that still remained forgotten in the form of guilt, of shameful latency, of the not said, no longer exists, because now everyone knows, everybody has trembled and bawled in the face of extermination, a sure sign that will never again occur. But what one exorcises in this way at little cost, and for the price of a few tears, will never in effect be reproduced, because it has always been in the midst of currently reproducing itself, and precisely in the very form in which one pretends to denounce it, in the medium itself of this supposed exorcism, television. Same process of forgetting, of liquidation, of extermination, same annihilation of memories and of history, same inverse, implosive radiation, same absorption without an echo, same black hole as Auschwitz. And one would like to have us believe that TV will lift the weight of Auschwitz by making a collective awareness radiate, whereas television is its perpetuation in another guise, this time no longer under the auspices of a site of annihilation, but of a medium of deterrence. What no one wants to understand is that Holocaust is primarily, and exclusively, an event, or, rather, a televised object, fundamental rule of McLuhan's, which must not be forgotten, that is to say, that one attempts to rekindle a cold historical event, tragic but cold, the first major event of cold systems, of cooling systems, of systems of deterrence and extermination that will then be deployed in other forms, including the Cold War, etc. And in regard to cold masses, the Jews no longer even concerned with their own death, and the eventually self-managed masses no longer even in revolt, deterred until death, deterred from their very own death, to rekindle this cold event through a cold medium, television, and for the masses who are themselves cold, who will only have the opportunity for a tactile thrill and a posthumous emotion, a deterrent thrill as well, which will make them spill into forgetting with a kind of good, aesthetic conscience of the catastrophe. In order to rekindle all that, the whole political and pedagogical orchestration that came from every direction to attempt to give meaning to the event, the televised event this time, was not at all excessive. Panicked blackmailing around the possible consequence of this broadcast on the imagination of children and others. All the pedagogues and social workers mobilized to filter the thing, as if there was some danger of infection in this artificial resurrection. The danger was really rather the opposite, from the cold to the cold, the social inertia of cold systems, of TV in particular. It was thus necessary that the whole world mobilize itself to remake the social, a hot social, heated discussion, hence communication, from the cold monster of extermination. One lacks stakes, investment, history, speech. That is the fundamental problem. The objective is thus to produce them at all cost, and this broadcast served this purpose, to capture the artificial heat of a dead event to warm the dead body of the social. Whence the addition of the supplementary medium to expand on the effect through feedback, immediate polls sanctioning the massive effect of the broadcast, the collective impact of the message, whereas it is well understood that the polls only verify the televisual success of the medium itself. But this confusion will never be lifted. From there, it is necessary to speak of the cold light of television, why it is harmless to the imagination, including that of children, because it no longer carries any imaginary, and this for the simple reason that it is no longer an image. By contrast with the cinema, which is still blessed, but less and less so because more and more contaminated by TV, with an intense imaginary, because the cinema is an image. That is to say, not only a screen and a visual form, but a myth, something that still retains something of the double, of the phantasm, of the mirror, of the dream, etc. Nothing of any of this in the TV image, which suggests nothing, which mesmerizes, which itself is nothing but a screen, not even that, a miniaturized terminal that, in fact, is immediately located in your head. You are the screen, and the TV watches you. It transistorizes all the neurons and passes through like a magnetic tape, a tape, not an image. The China syndrome. The fundamental stake is at the level of television and information. Just as the extermination of the Jews disappeared behind the televised event Holocaust, the cold medium of television having been simply substituted for the cold system of extermination one believed to be exorcising through it, so the China syndrome is a great example of the supremacy of the televised event over the nuclear event, which, itself, remains improbable and in some sense imaginary. Besides, the film shows this to be the case, without wanting to. That TV is present precisely where it happens is not coincidental. It is the intrusion of TV into the reactor that seems to give rise to the nuclear incident, because TV is like its anticipation and its model in the everyday universe, television of the real and of the real world, Because TV and information in general are a form of catastrophe in the formal and topological sense, René Thorn gives the word a radical qualitative change of a whole system. Or, rather, TV and the nuclear are of the same nature. Behind the hot and negentropic concepts of energy and information, they have the same power of deterrence as cold systems do. TV itself is also a nuclear process of chain reaction, but implosive. It cools and neutralizes the meaning and the energy of events. Thus the nuclear, behind the presumed risk of explosion, that is to say of hot catastrophe, conceals a long, cold catastrophe, the universalization of a system of deterrence. At the end of the film again comes the second massive intrusion of the press and of TV that instigates the drama, the murder of the technical director by the special forces, a drama that substitutes for the nuclear catastrophe that will not occur. The homology of the nuclear and of television can be read directly in the images. Nothing resembles the control and telecommand headquarters of the nuclear power station more than TV studios, and the nuclear consoles are combined with those of the recording and broadcasting studios in the same imaginary. Thus everything takes place between these two poles, of the other center, that of the reactor, in principle the veritable heart of the matter. We will know nothing. It, like the real, has vanished and become illegible, and is at bottom unimportant in the film. When one attempts to suggest it to us, in its imminent catastrophe, it does not work on the imaginary plane. The drama unfolds on the screens and nowhere else. Harrisburg, Watergate, and Network. Such is the trilogy of the China Syndrome, an indissoluble trilogy in which one no longer knows which is the effect and which is the symptom. The ideological argument, Watergate effect, isn't it nothing but the symptom of the nuclear, Harrisburg effect, or of the computer science model, network effect? The real, Harrisburg, isn't it nothing but the symptom of the imaginary, network and China Syndrome, or the opposite? Marvelous indifferentiation, ideal constellation of simulation. Marvelous title, then, this China Syndrome, because the reversibility of symptoms and their convergence in the same process constitute precisely what we call a syndrome. That it is Chinese adds the poetic and intellectual quality of a conundrum or supplication. Obsessive conjunction of the China Syndrome and Harrisburg. But is all that so involuntary? Without positing magical links between the simulacrum and the real, it is clear that the syndrome is not a stranger to the real accident in Harrisburg, not according to a causal logic, but according to the relations of contagion and silent analogy that link the real to models and to simulacra. To television's induction of the nuclear into the film corresponds, with a troubling obviousness, the film's induction of the nuclear incident in Harrisburg. Strange procession of a film over the real, the most surprising that was given us to witness. The real corresponded point by point to the simulacrum, including the suspended, incomplete character of the catastrophe, which is essential from the point of view of deterrence. The real arranged itself, in the image of the film, to produce a simulation of catastrophe. From there to reverse our logic and to see in the China Syndrome the veritable event and in Harrisburg its simulacrum, there is only one step that must be cheerfully taken. Because it is via the same logic that, in the film, nuclear reality arises from the television effect, and that in reality Harrisburg arises from the China Syndrome cinema effect. But the China Syndrome is also not the original prototype of Harrisburg. One is not the simulacrum of which the other would be the real. There are only simulacra, and Harrisburg is a sort of second-order simulation. There is certainly a chain reaction somewhere, and we will perhaps die of it, but this chain reaction is never that of the nuclear. It is that of simulacra and of the simulation where all the energy of the real is effectively swallowed, no longer in a spectacular nuclear explosion, but in a secret and continuous implosion, and that today perhaps takes a more deathly turn than that of all the explosions that rock us. Because an explosion is always a promise, it is our hope. Note how much, in the film as in Harrisburg, the whole world waits for something to blow up, for destruction to announce itself and remove us from this unnameable panic, from this panic of deterrence that it exercises in the invisible form of the nuclear. That the heart of the reactor at last reveals its hot power of destruction, that it reassures us about the presence of energy, albeit catastrophic, and bestows its spectacle on us. Because unhappiness is when there is no nuclear spectacle, no spectacle of nuclear energy in itself. Hiroshima is over, and it is for that reason that it is rejected. It would be perfectly accepted if it lent itself to spectacle as previous forms of energy did. Parousia of catastrophe, substantial food for our messianic libido. But that is precisely what will never happen. What will happen will never again be the explosion, but the implosion. No more energy in its spectacular and pathetic form, all the romanticism of the explosion, which had so much charm, being at the same time that of revolution, but the cold energy of the simulacrum and of its distillation in homeopathic doses in the cold systems of information. What else do the media dream of besides creating the event simply by their presence? Everyone decries it, but everyone is secretly fascinated by this eventuality. Such is the logic of simulacra. It is no longer that of divine predestination, it is that of the procession of models, but it is just as inexorable. And it is because of this that events no longer have meaning. It is not that they are insignificant in themselves, it is that they were preceded by the model, with which their processes only coincided. Thus it would have been marvelous to repeat the script for the China syndrome at Fessenheim, during the visit offered to the journalists by the EDF, French Electric Company, to repeat on this occasion the accident linked to the magic eye, to the provocative presence of the media. Alas, nothing happened. And on the other hand, yes. So powerful is the logic of simulacra, a week after, the unions discovered fissures in the reactors. Miracle of contagions, miracle of analogic chain reactions. Thus, the essence of the film is not in any respect the Watergate effect in the person of Jane Fonda, not in any respect TV as a means of exposing nuclear vices, but on the contrary TV as the twin orbit and twin chain reaction of the nuclear one. Besides, just at the end, and there the film is unrelenting in regard to its own argument, when Jane Fonda makes the truth explode directly, maximum Watergate effect, her image is juxtaposed with what will inexorably follow it and efface it on the screen, a commercial of some kind. The network effect goes far beyond the Watergate effect and spreads mysteriously into the Harrisburg effect, that is to say not into the nuclear threat, but into the simulation of nuclear catastrophe. So, it is simulation that is effective, never the real. The simulation of nuclear catastrophe is the strategic result of this generic and universal undertaking of deterrence, accustoming the people to the ideology and the discipline of absolute security, to the metaphysics of fission and fissure. To this end the fissure must be a fiction. A real catastrophe would delay things, it would constitute a retrograde incident, of the explosive kind, without changing the course of things. Did Hiroshima perceptibly deter, the universal process of deterrence? In the film, also, real fusion would be a bad argument. The film would regress to the level of a disaster movie, weak by definition, because it means returning things to their pure event. The China syndrome, itself, finds its strength in filtering catastrophe, in the distillation of the nuclear spectre through the omnipresent Hertzian relays of information. It teaches us, once again without meaning to, that nuclear catastrophe does not occur, is not meant to happen, in the real either, any more than the atomic clash was at the dawning of the Cold War. The equilibrium of terror rests on the eternal deferral of the atomic clash. The atom and the nuclear are made to be disseminated for deterrent ends. The power of catastrophe must, instead of stupidly exploding, be disseminated in homeopathic, molecular doses, in the continuous reservoirs of information. Therein lies the true contamination, never biological and radioactive, but, rather, a mental destructuration through a mental strategy of catastrophe. If one looks carefully, the film introduces us to this mental strategy, and in going further, it even delivers a lesson diametrically opposed to that of Watergate. If every strategy today is that of mental terror and of deterrence tied to the suspension and the eternal simulation of catastrophe, then the only means of mitigating this scenario would be to make the catastrophe arrive, to produce or to reproduce a real catastrophe, to which nature is at times given. In its inspired moments, it is God who through his cataclysms unknots the equilibrium of terror in which humans are imprisoned. Closer to us, this is what terrorism is occupied with as well, making real, palpable violence surface in opposition to the invisible violence of security. Besides, therein lies terrorism's apocalypse now. Coppola makes his film like the Americans made war. In this sense, it is the best possible testimonial, with the same immoderation, the same excessive means, the same monstrous candor, and the same success. The war as entrenchment, as technological and psychedelic fantasy, the war as a succession of special effects, the war become film even before being filmed. The war abolishes itself in its technological test, and for Americans it was primarily that, a test site, a gigantic territory in which to test their arms, their methods, their power. Coppola does nothing but that, test cinema's power of intervention, test the impact of a cinema that has become an immeasurable machinery of special effects. In this sense, his film is really the extension of the war through other means, the pinnacle of this failed war, and its apotheosis. The war became film, the film becomes war, the two are joined by their common hemorrhage into technology. The real war is waged by Coppola as it is by Westmoreland, without counting the inspired irony of having forests and Philippine villages napalm to retrace the hell of South Vietnam. One revisits everything through cinema and one begins again, the Malochian joy of filming, the sacrificial joy of so many millions spent, of such a holocaust of means, of so many misadventures, and the remarkable paranoia that from the beginning conceived of this film as a historical, global event, in which, in the mind of the creator, the war in Vietnam would have been nothing other than what it is, would not fundamentally have existed, and it is necessary for us to believe in this. The war in Vietnam in itself perhaps in fact never happened, it is a dream, a baroque dream of napalm and of the tropics, a psychotropic dream that had the goal neither of a victory nor of a policy at stake, but, rather, the sacrificial, excessive deployment of a power already filming itself as it unfolded, perhaps waiting for nothing but consecration by a superfilm, which completes the mass spectacle effect of this war. No real distance, no critical sense, no desire for raising consciousness in relation to the war, and in a sense this is the brutal quality of this film, not being rotten with the moral psychology of war. Coppola can certainly deck out his helicopter captain in a ridiculous hat of the light cavalry, and make him crush the Vietnamese village to the sound of Wagner's music. Those are not critical, distant signs, they are immersed in the machinery, they are part of the special effect, and he himself makes movies in the same way, with the same retro-megalomania, and the same non-signifying furor, with the same clownish effect in overdrive. But there it is, he hits us with that, it is there, it is bewildering, and one can say to oneself, how is such a horror possible, not that of the war, but that of the film strictly speaking? But there is no answer, there is no possible verdict, and one can even rejoice in this monstrous trick, exactly as with Wagner, but one can always retrieve a tiny little idea that is not nasty, that is not a value judgment, but that tells you the war in Vietnam and this film are cut from the same cloth, that nothing separates them, that this film is part of the war. If the Americans, seemingly, lost the other one, they certainly won this one. Apocalypse Now is a global victory. Cinematographic power equal and superior to that of the industrial and military complexes, equal or superior to that of the Pentagon and of governments. And all of a sudden, the film is not without interest, it retrospectively illuminates, not even retrospectively, because the film is a phase of this war without end, what was already crazy about this war, irrational in political terms. The Americans and the Vietnamese are already reconciled. Right after the end of the hostilities, the Americans offered economic aid, exactly as if they had annihilated the jungle and the towns, exactly as they are making their film today. One has understood nothing, neither about the war nor about cinema, at least the latter, if one has not grasped this lack of distinction that is no longer either an ideological or a moral one of good and evil, but one of the reversibility of both destruction and production, of the imminence of a thing in its very revolution, of the organic metabolism of all the technologies, of the carpet of bombs in the strip of film. The Bobog effect, implosion and deterrence. The Bobog effect, the Bobog machine, the Bobog thing, how to give it a name? Enigma of this carcass of flux and signs, of networks and circuits, the final impulse to translate a structure that no longer has a name, the structure of social relations given over to superficial ventilation, animation, self-management, information, media, and to an irreversibly deep implosion. Monument to the games of mass simulation, the Pompidou Center functions as an incinerator absorbing all the cultural energy and devouring it, a bit like the Black Monolith in 2001, insane convection of all the contents that came there to be materialized, to be absorbed, and to be annihilated. All around, the neighborhood is nothing but a protective zone remodeling, disinfection, a snobbish and hygienic design, but above all in a figurative sense, it is a machine for making emptiness. It is a bit like the real danger nuclear power stations pose, not lack of security, pollution, explosion, but a system of maximum security that radiates around them, the protective zone of control and deterrence that extends, slowly but surely, over the territory, a technical, ecological, economic, geopolitical glacis. What does the nuclear matter? The station is a matrix in which an absolute model of security is elaborated, which will encompass the whole social field, and which is fundamentally a model of deterrence. It is the same one that controls us globally, under the sign of peaceful coexistence and of the simulation of atomic danger. The same model, with the same proportions, is elaborated at the center: cultural fission, political deterrence. This said, the circulation of fluids is unequal. Ventilation, cooling, electrical networks, the traditional fluids circulate there very well. Already the circulation of the human flux is less assured. The archaic solution of escalators in plastic sleeves, one ought to be aspirated, propelled, or something, but with a mobility that would be up to this baroque theatricality of fluids that is the source of the originality of the carcass. As for the material of the works, of objects, of books, and the so-called polyvalent interior space, these no longer circulate at all. It is the opposite of Roissy, where from a futurist center of spatial design radiating towards satellites, etc., one ends up completely flat in front of traditional airplanes. But the incoherence is the same. What happened to money, this other fluid? What happened to its mode of circulation, of emulsion, of fallout at Beaubourg? Same contradiction even in the behavior of the personnel, assigned to the polyvalent space and without a private workspace. On their feet and mobile, the people affect a cool demeanor, more supple, very contemporary, adapted to the structure of a modern space. Seated in their corner, which is precisely not one, they exhaust themselves secreting an artificial solitude, remaking their bubble. Therein is also a great tactic of deterrence. One condemns them to using all their energy in this individual defense. Curiously, one thus finds the same contradiction that characterizes the Beaubourg thing: a mobile exterior, commuting, cool and modern, an interior shriveled by the same old values. This space of deterrence, articulated on the ideology of visibility, of transparency, of polyvalency, of consensus and contact, and sanctioned by the blackmail to security, is today, virtually, that of all social relations. All of social discourse is there, and on this level as well as on that of the treatment of culture, Beaubourg flagrantly contradicts its explicit objectives, a nice monument to our modernity. It is nice to think that the idea did not come to some revolutionary spirit, but to the logicians of the established order, deprived of all critical intelligence, and thus closer to the truth, capable, in their obstinacy, of putting in place a machine that is fundamentally uncontrollable, that in its very success escapes them, and that is the most exact reflection, even in its contradictions, of the current state of things. Certainly, all the cultural contents of Beaubourg are anachronistic, because only an empty interior could correspond to this architectural envelope. The general impression being that everything here has come out of a coma, that everything wants to be animation and is only reanimation, and that this is good because culture is dead, a condition that Beaubourg admirably retraces, but in a dishonest fashion, whereas one should have triumphantly accepted this death and erected a monument or an anti-monument equivalent to the phallic inanity of the Eiffel Tower in its time. Monument to total disconnection, to hyperreality, and to the implosion of culture achieved today for us in the effect of transistorized circuits always threatened by a gigantic short circuit. Baudrillard is already an imperial compression figure of a culture already crushed by its own weight, like moving automobiles suddenly frozen in a geometric solid. Like the cars of Caesar, survivors of an ideal accident, no longer external, but internal to the metallic and mechanical structure, and which would have produced tons of cubic scrap iron, where the chaos of tubes, levers, frames, of metal and human flesh inside is tailored to the geometric size of the smallest possible space. Thus the culture of Baudrillard is ground, twisted, cut up, and pressed into its smallest simple elements, a bundle of defunct transmissions and metabolisms. Frozen like a science fiction mechanoid. But instead of breaking and compressing all culture here in this carcass that in any case has the appearance of a compression, instead of that, one exhibits Caesar there. One exhibits de Buffet and the counterculture, whose inverse simulation acts as a referential for the defunct culture. In this carcass that could have served as a mausoleum to the useless operationality of signs, one re-exhibits Tingley's ephemeral and auto-destructive machines under the sign of the eternity of culture. Thus one neutralizes everything together. Tingley is embalmed in the museal institution. Baudrillard falls back on its supposed artistic contents. Fortunately, this whole simulacrum of cultural values is annihilated in advance by the external architecture, because this architecture, with its networks of tubes and the look it has of being an expo or World's Fair building, with its calculated fragility deterring any traditional mentality or monumentality, overtly proclaims that our time will never again be that of duration, that our only temporality is that of the accelerated cycle and of recycling, that of the circuit and of the transit of fluids. Our only culture in the end is that of hydrocarbons, that of refining, cracking, breaking cultural molecules and of their recombination into synthesized products. This, the Baudrillard Museum wishes to conceal, but the Baudrillard cadaver proclaims. And this is what underlies the beauty of the cadaver and the failure of the interior spaces. In any case, the very ideology of cultural production is antithetical to all culture, as is that of visibility and of the polyvalent space. Culture is a site of the secret, of seduction, of initiation, of a restrained and highly ritualized symbolic exchange. Nothing can be done about it. Too bad for the masses, too bad for Baudrillard. What should, then, have been placed in Baudrillard? Nothing. The void that would have signified the disappearance of any culture of meaning and aesthetic sentiment. But this is still too romantic and destructive. This void would still have had value as a masterpiece of anti-culture. Perhaps revolving strobe lights and gyroscopic lights, striating the space, for which the crowd would have provided the moving base element. In fact, Baudrillard illustrates very well that an order of simulacra only establishes itself on the alibi of the previous order. Here, a cadaver all in flux and surface connections gives itself as content a traditional culture of depth. An order of prior simulacra, that of meaning, furnishes the empty substance of a subsequent order, which, itself, no longer even knows the distinction between signifier and signified, nor between form and content. The question, what should have been placed in Baudrillard, is thus absurd. It cannot be answered because the topical distinction between interior and exterior should no longer be posed. There lies our truth, the truth of Mobius, doubtless an unrealizable utopia, but which Baudrillard still points to as right, to the degree to which any of its contents is a counter-meaning and annihilated in advance by the form. Yet, if you had to have something in Baudrillard, it should have been a labyrinth, a combinatory, infinite library, an aleatory redistribution of destinies through games or lotteries, in short, the universe of Borges, or even the circular ruins, the slowed-down enchainment of individuals dreamed up by each other, not a dream world Disneyland, a laboratory of practical fiction. An experimentation with all the different processes of representation, diffraction, implosion, slow motion, aleatory linkage and decoupling, a bit like at the Exploratorium in San Francisco or in the novels of Philip K. Dick, in short a culture of simulation and of fascination, and not always one of production and meaning. This is what might be proposed that would not be a miserable anti-culture. Is it possible? Not here, evidently. But this culture takes place elsewhere, everywhere, nowhere. From today, the only real cultural practice, that of the masses, ours, there is no longer a difference, is a manipulative, aleatory practice, a labyrinthine practice of signs, and one that no longer has any meaning. In another way, however, it is not true that there is no coherence between form and content at Baudrillard. It is true if one gives any credence to the official cultural project. But exactly the opposite occurs there. Baudrillard is nothing but a huge effort to transmute this famous traditional culture of meaning into the aleatory order of signs, into an order of simulacra, the third, that is completely homogeneous with the flux and pipes of the facade. And it is in order to prepare the masses for this new semiurgic order that one brings them together here with the opposite pretext of acculturating them to meaning and depth. One must thus start with this axiom: Baudrillard is a monument of cultural deterrence. Within a museal scenario that only serves to keep up the humanist fiction of culture, it is a veritable fashioning of the death of culture that takes place, and it is a veritable cultural mourning for which the masses are joyously gathered. And they throw themselves at it. There lies the supreme irony of Baudrillard: the masses throw themselves at it not because they salivate for that culture which they have been denied for centuries, but because they have for the first time the opportunity to massively participate in this great mourning of a culture that, in the end, they have always detested. The misunderstanding is therefore complete when one denounces Baudrillard as a cultural mystification of the masses. The masses, themselves, rush there to enjoy this execution, this dismemberment, this operational prostitution of a culture finally truly liquidated, including all counterculture that is nothing but its apotheosis. The masses rush toward Baudrillard as they rush toward disaster sites, with the same irresistible elan. Better, they are the disaster of Baudrillard. Their number, their stampede, their fascination, their itch to see everything is objectively a deadly and catastrophic behavior for the whole undertaking. Not only does their weight put the building in danger, but their adhesion, their curiosity annihilates the very contents of this culture of animation. This rush can no longer be measured against what was proposed as the cultural objective, it is its radical negation, in both its excess and success. It is thus the masses who assume the role of catastrophic agent in this structure of catastrophe. It is the masses themselves who put an end to mass culture. Circulating in the space of transparency, the masses are certainly converted into flux, but at the same time, through their opacity and inertia, they put an end to this polyvalent space. One invites the masses to participate, to simulate, to play with the models. They go one better. They participate and manipulate so well that they efface all the meaning one wants to give to the operation and put the very infrastructure of the edifice in danger. Thus, always a sort of parody, a hypersimulation in response to cultural simulation, transforms the masses, who should only be the livestock of culture, into the agents of the execution of this culture, of which Baudrillard was only the shameful incarnation. One must applaud this success of cultural deterrence. All the anti-artists, leftists, and those who hold culture in contempt have never even gotten close to approaching the dissuasive efficacy of this monumental black hole that is Baudrillard. It is a truly revolutionary operation, precisely because it is involuntary, insane, and uncontrolled, whereas any operation meant to put an end to culture only serves, as one knows, to resurrect it. To tell the truth, the only content of Baudrillard is the masses themselves, whom the building treats like a converter, like a black box, or, in terms of input-output, just like a refinery handles petroleum products or a flood of unprocessed material. It has never been so clear that the content here, culture, elsewhere, information or commodities, is nothing but the phantom support for the operation of the medium itself, whose function is always to induce mass, to produce a homogeneous human and mental flux. An immense to and fro movement similar to that of suburban commuters, absorbed and ejected at fixed times by their workplace. And it is precisely work that is at issue here, a work of testing, polling, and directed interrogation. The people come here to select objects, responses to all the questions they might ask themselves, or rather they come themselves in response to the functional and directed question that the objects constitute, More than a chain of work, it is thus a question of a programmatic discipline whose constraints have been effaced behind a veneer of tolerance. Well beyond traditional institutions of capital, the hypermarket, or the Boborg hypermarket of culture, is already the model of all future forms of controlled socialization, retotalization in a homogeneous space, time of all the dispersed functions of the body and of social life, work, leisure, media culture, retranscription of all the contradictory currents in terms of integrated circuits, space-time of a whole operational simulation of social life. For that, the mass of consumers must be equivalent or homologous to the mass of products. It is the confrontation and the fusion of these two masses that occurs in the hypermarket as it does at Boborg, and that makes of them something very different from the traditional sites of culture, monuments, museums, galleries, libraries, community arts centers, etc. Here a critical mass beyond which the commodity becomes hypercommodity and culture hyperculture is elaborated, that is to say no longer linked to distinct exchanges or determined needs, but to a kind of total descriptive universe, or integrated circuit that implosion traverses through and through incessant circulation of choices, readings, references, marks, decoding. Here cultural objects, as elsewhere the objects of consumption, have no other end than to maintain you in a state of mass integration, of transistorized flux, of a magnetized molecule. It is what one comes to learn. In a hypermarket, hyperreality of the commodity, it is what one comes to learn at Boborg, the hyperreality of culture. Already with the traditional museum, this cutting up, this regrouping, this interference of all cultures, this unconditional aestheticization that constitutes the hyperreality of culture begins, but the museum is still a memory. Never, as it did here, has culture lost its memory in the service of stockpiling and functional redistribution. And this translates a more general fact, that throughout the civilized world the construction of stockpiles of objects has brought with it the complementary process of stockpiles of people, the line, waiting, traffic jams, concentration, the camp. That is mass production, not in the sense of a massive production or for use by the masses, but the production of the masses. The masses as the final product of all sociality, and, at the same time, as putting an end to sociality, because these masses that one wants us to believe are the social, are on the contrary the site of the implosion of the social. The masses are the increasingly dense sphere in which the whole social comes to be imploded, and to be devoured in an uninterrupted process of simulation. Whence this concave mirror? It is from seeing the masses in the interior that the masses will be tempted to rush in. Typical marketing method, the whole ideology of transparency here takes on its meaning. Or again, it is in staging a reduced ideal model that one hopes for an accelerated gravitation, an automatic agglutination of culture as an automatic agglomeration of the masses. Same process, nuclear operation of a chain reaction, or specular operation of white magic. Thus for the first time, Boborg is at the level of culture what the hypermarket is at the level of the commodity, the perfect circulatory operator, the demonstration of anything, commodity, culture, crowd, compressed air, through its own accelerated circulation. But if the supply of objects brings along with it the stockpiling of men, the latent violence in the supply of objects brings with it the inverse violence of men. Every stock is violent, and there is a specific violence in any mass of men also, because of the fact that it implodes, a violence proper to its gravitation, to its densification around its own locus of inertia. The masses are a locus of inertia, and through that a locus of a completely new, inexplicable violence different from explosive violence. Critical mass, implosive mass. Beyond 30,000 it poses the risk of bending the structure of Boborg. If the masses magnetized by the structure become a destructive variable of the structure itself, if those who conceived of the project wanted this, but how to hope for this, if they thus programmed the chance of putting an end with one blow to both architecture and culture, then Boborg constitutes the most audacious object and the most successful happening of the century. Make Boborg bend. New motto of a revolutionary order. Useless to set fire to it, useless to contest it. Do it. It is the best way of destroying it. The success of Baudrillard is no longer a mystery. The people go there for that. They throw themselves on this building, whose fragility already breeds catastrophe, with the single goal of making it bend. Certainly they obey the imperative of deterrence. One gives them an object to consume, a culture to devour, an edifice to manipulate. But at the same time they expressly aim, and without knowing it, at this annihilation. The onslaught is the only act the masses can produce as such, a projectile mass that challenges the edifice of mass culture, that witly replies with its weight, that is to say with the characteristic most deprived of meaning, the stupidest, the least cultural one they possess, to the challenge of culturality thrown at it by Baudrillard. To the challenge of mass acculturation to a sterilized culture, the masses respond with a destructive eruption, which is prolonged in a brutal manipulation. To mental deterrence the masses respond with a direct physical deterrence. It is their own challenge. Their ruse, which is to respond in the very terms by which they are solicited. But beyond that, to respond to the simulation in which one imprisons them with an enthusiastic social process that surpasses the objectives of the former and acts as a destructive hypersimulation. People have the desire to take everything, to pillage everything, to swallow everything, to manipulate everything. Seeing, deciphering, learning does not touch them. The only massive effect is that of manipulation. The organizers, and the artists and intellectuals, are frightened by this uncontrollable watchfulness, because they never count on anything but the apprenticeship of the masses to the spectacle of culture. They never count on this active, destructive fascination, a brutal and original response to the gift of an incomprehensible culture, an attraction that has all the characteristics of breaking and entering and of the violation of a sanctuary. Baudrillard could have or should have disappeared the day after the inauguration, dismantled and kidnapped by the crowd, which would have been the only possible response to the absurd challenge of the transparency and democracy of culture, each person taking away a fetishized bolt of this culture itself fetishized. The people come to touch, they look as if they were touching, their gaze is only an aspect of tactile manipulation. It is certainly a question of a tactile universe, no longer a visual or discursive one, and the people are directly implicated in a process, to manipulate to be manipulated, to ventilate to be ventilated, to circulate to make circulate, which is no longer of the order of representation, nor of distance, nor of reflection. It is something that is part of panic, and of a world in panic. Panic in slow motion, no external variable. It is the violence internal to a saturated ensemble. Implosion. Baudrillard cannot even burn, everything is foreseen. Fire, explosion, destruction are no longer the imaginary alternative to this type of building. It is implosion that is the form of abolishing the quaternary world, both cybernetic and combinatory. Subversion, violent destruction is what corresponds to a mode of production. To a universe of networks, of combinatory theory, and of flow correspond reversal and implosion. The same for institutions, the state, power, etc. The dream of seeing all that explode by dint of contradictions is precisely nothing but a dream. What is produced in reality is that the institutions implode of themselves, by dint of ramifications, feedback, overdeveloped control circuits. Power implodes, this is its current mode of disappearance. Such is the case for the city. Fires, war, plague, revolutions, criminal marginality, catastrophes, the whole problematic of the anticity, of the negativity internal or external to the city, has some archaic relation to its true mode of annihilation. Even the scenario of the underground city, the Chinese version of the burial of structures, is naive. The city does not repeat itself any longer according to a schema of reproduction still dependent on the general schema of production, or according to a schema of resemblance still dependent on a schema of representation. That is how one still restored after the Second World War. The city no longer revives, even deep down it is remade starting from a sort of genetic code that makes it possible to repeat it indefinitely starting with an accumulated cybernetic memory. Gone even the Borgesian utopia, of the map coextensive with the territory and doubling it in its entirety, today the simulacrum no longer goes by way of the double and of duplication, but by way of genetic miniaturization. End of representation and implosion, there also, of the whole space in an infinitesimal memory, which forgets nothing, and which belongs to no one. Simulation of an imminent, increasingly dense, irreversible order, one that is potentially saturated and that will never again witness the liberating explosion. We were a culture of liberating violence, rationality. Whether it be that of capital, of the liberation of productive forces, of the irreversible extension of the field of reason and of the field of value, of the conquered and colonized space including the universal, whether it be that of the revolution, which anticipates the future forms of the social and of the energy of the social, the schema is the same, that of an expanding sphere, whether through slow or violent phases, that of a liberated energy, the imaginary of radiation. The violence that accompanies it is that of a wider world, it is that of production. This violence is dialectical, energetic, cathartic. It is the one we have learned to analyze and that is familiar to us, that which traces the paths of the social and which leads to the saturation of the whole field of the social. It is a violence that is determined, analytical, liberating. A whole other violence appears today, which we no longer know how to analyze, because it escapes the traditional schema of explosive violence, implosive violence that no longer results from the extension of a system, but from its saturation and its retraction, as is the case for physical stellar systems. A violence that follows an inordinate densification of the social, the state of an overregulated system, a network, of knowledge, information, power, that is overencumbered, and of a hypertrophic control investing all the interstitial pathways. This violence is unintelligible to us because our whole imaginary has as its axis the logic of expanding systems. It is indecipherable because undetermined. Perhaps it no longer even comes from the schema of indeterminacy. Because the aleatory models that have taken over from classical models of determination and causality are not fundamentally different. They translate the passage of defined systems of expansion to systems of production and expansion on all levels, in a star or in a rhizome. It doesn't matter, all the philosophies of the release of energy, of the irradiation of intensities and of the molecularization of desire go in the same direction, that of a saturation as far as the interstitial and the infinity of networks. The difference from the molar to the molecular is only a modulation, the last perhaps, in the fundamental energetic process of expanding systems. Something else if we move from a millennial phase of the liberation and disconnection of energies to a phase of implosion, after a kind of maximum radiation. See Bataille's concepts of loss and expenditure in this sense, and the solar myth of an inexhaustible radiation, on which he founds his sumptuary anthropology. It is the last explosive and radiating myth of our philosophy, the last fire of artifice of a fundamentally general economy, but this no longer has any meaning for us, too. A phase of the reversion of the social, gigantic reversion of a field once the point of saturation is reached. The stellar systems also do not cease to exist once their radiating energy is dissipated, they implode according to a process that is at first slow, and then progressively accelerates, they contract at a fabulous speed, and become involutive systems, which absorb all the surrounding energies, so that they become black holes where the world as we know it, as radiation and indefinite energy potential, is abolished. Perhaps the great metropolises, certainly these if this hypothesis has any meaning, have become sites of implosion in this sense, sites of the absorption and reabsorption of the social itself whose golden age, contemporaneous with the double concept of capital and revolution, is doubtless past. The social involutes slowly or brutally, in a field of inertia, which already envelops the political. The opposite energy? One must stop oneself from taking implosion for a negative process inert, regressive, like the one language imposes on us by exalting the opposite terms of evolution, of revolution. Implosion is a process specific to incalculable consequences. May 1968 was without a doubt the first implosive episode, that is to say contrary to its rewriting in terms of revolutionary prosopopoeia, a first violent reaction to the saturation of the social, a retraction, a challenge to the hegemony of the social, in contradiction, moreover, to the ideology of the participants themselves, who thought they were going further into the social, such as the imaginary that still dominates us, and moreover a good part of the events of 1968 were still able to come from that revolutionary dynamic and explosive violence, but something else began. At the same time the violent involution of the social, determined on that score, and the consecutive and sudden implosion of power, in a brief moment of time, but that never stopped afterward. Fundamentally it is that which continues, the implosion, of the social, of institutions, of power, and not at all an unlocatable revolutionary dynamic. On the contrary, revolution itself, the idea of revolution also implodes, and this implosion carries weightier consequences than the revolution itself. Certainly, since 1968, and thanks to 1968, the social, like the desert, grows participation, management, generalized self-management, etc., but at the same time it comes close in multiple places, more numerous than in 1968, to its disaffection and to its total reversion. SYLLOJISM, intelligible to historical reason.